She's just a waitress. Ignore her. William Harrington didn't even look up when he said it, his voice calm, effortless, the kind of quiet authority that made conversations shrink and shoulders stiffen around him. And yet the words landed heavier than the crystal glasses resting on the polished walnut table, heavier than the low golden light hanging from the chandelier above, heavier than the silence that followed. Because Ava Brooks heard every syllable as she stood beside the table, holding a silver tray steady in both hands, her posture straight, her expression composed, though her fingers tightened just slightly around the edge of the tray as she watched the men in tailored suits lean forward, their leather chairs creaking softly against the hardwood floor, their watches catching the warm light in brief flashes like small signals of power, and the scent of grilled filet mignon and aged bourbon drifted through the private dining room of Langford House, one of the most exclusive restaurants in downtown Chicago, where reservations were booked months in advance and deals worth hundreds of millions were often decided between bites of steak and quiet, calculated smiles. And Ava had worked there long enough to recognize the rhythm of these nights, the low murmurs, the careful laughter, the subtle glances exchanged between investors. But tonight something felt different, because the folder resting in front of William Harrington was thicker than usual, the embossed logo of Monroe Capital visible in the corner, and the numbers she had glimpsed earlier while refilling water glasses still lingered in her mind, sharp and unsettling. The kind of detail that refused to let go once it had been noticed, and Ava shifted her weight slightly, her black flat silent against the floor as she moved to refill a glass, her name tag catching the light briefly. Ava Brooks. Simple, understated, easy to overlook, just like she had learned to be. Because invisibility was part of the job, part of survival, especially for someone juggling 2 shifts a day while finishing online courses late at night in her small studio apartment 12 blocks away, where the radiator clicked loudly in winter and the city lights filtered through thin blinds. But Ava didn't mind the long hours, not when they paid for her tuition, not when every shift brought her one step closer to finishing the degree she had paused 3 years earlier when her mother got sick. And now as she stepped back, she noticed the page William Harrington had just turned, the column of figures, the claws buried halfway down, and something tightened in her chest, the kind of instinct that had guided her through textbooks and late-night case studies, the kind that whispered when something didn't add up, and she hesitated for just a second, her gaze flicking from the document to the calm confidence on William's face. And around the table Daniel Monroe was already smiling, his cufflinks glinting as he leaned forward, pen poised, the quiet anticipation in the room growing thicker, like the air before a summer storm. And Ava felt her heartbeat slow instead of quicken, her mind tracing the numbers again, the percentages, the liability shift hidden behind polished legal phrasing, and she realized that once the pen touched the paper, there would be no undoing it, and still no one noticed her. Not the investors discussing projections, not the manager standing discreetly near the door, not even William Harrington, whose focus remained on the deal, his expression calm and certain, and Ava took a slow breath, her grip on the tray steady again, the faint clink of ice in a glass the only sound near her. And for a moment she considered stepping away, letting the silence swallow her presence the way it always did. But the numbers stayed in her mind, clear and unshakable, and she remained where she was, standing quietly beside the table, unseen, unheard, and yet closer than anyone realized to the moment that would change the entire room. The quiet in the private dining room stretched longer than usual, the kind of silence that felt polished and intentional, shaped by years of power lunches and late-night negotiations, and Ava Brooks remained still beside the table, her eyes moving carefully across the details in front of her, the silverware aligned with precise spacing, the faint reflection of the chandelier in the crystal water glasses, the soft hum of the city drifting through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, and she felt the familiar calm settle in her chest, the same calm she used to find during late nights studying contract law at her small kitchen table, where textbooks sat stacked beside a chipped ceramic mug and the sound of traffic below blended into a steady background rhythm, because Ava had always learned to focus when everything else blurred, and that focus returned now as her attention drifted back to the document, the percentages repeating in her mind, the subtle language that shifted responsibility without drawing attention, and she remembered a professor once saying that the most dangerous clauses were never loud. They were quiet, wrapped in professional phrasing, hidden behind confidence. And Ava felt that same quiet danger now, as Daniel Monroe leaned back in his chair. His smile relaxed, his fingers lightly tapping the edge of the folder, the gesture casual but controlled, like someone who already knew how the night would end. And across from him, William Harrington adjusted his cuff, the movement smooth, measured, the faint glimmer of his watch catching the light as he reached for the pen resting beside his plate. And the soft scrape of leather chairs shifted around the table as the other executives leaned forward slightly, anticipation building in small, almost invisible movements. And Ava noticed the restaurant manager, Victor Lang, standing near the doorway, his posture professional but attentive, watching the table with the careful awareness that came from years of hosting powerful clients. And beyond him, a server passed quietly through the hallway, the muted clatter of dishes fading as the door closed again, sealing the room back into its insulated world of quiet influence. And Ava exhaled slowly, her grip on the tray steady, but her mind continued to circle the numbers, the clause, the timing, and she remembered the hospital bill folded inside her purse, the one she had reviewed earlier during her break. The numbers there just as unforgiving, just as precise, and she thought about the long hours, the late nights, the reason she had returned to school after everything had changed, and she felt the familiar resolve rise quietly beneath her calm expression, because she had learned that sometimes the smallest moment could shape everything that followed. And now William Harrington lowered his gaze to the final page, his pen hovering just above the paper, and Daniel Monroe's smile widened slightly, subtle but noticeable to anyone paying attention, and Ava felt her pulse slow, her thoughts aligning with sudden clarity. The clause no longer just a suspicion but a certainty forming in her mind, and the room felt warmer. The soft glow of the chandelier reflecting across the polished table, the skyline outside darkening. As the last streaks of sunset faded behind distant buildings, and the air carried the quiet weight of a decision about to be made, and still no one looked at Ava. No one considered the waitress standing beside them, her posture calm, her expression neutral, her presence nearly invisible, and yet her eyes remained fixed on the document, and she realized that the moment was already unfolding, the seconds narrowing, the quiet before a shift no one else sensed, and she took another slow breath, her voice still unspoken, her decision forming with quiet certainty as William Harrington prepared to sign. William Harrington's pen hovered a fraction of an inch above the signature line, the polished black surface reflecting the warm chandelier light as his fingers adjusted their grip with the quiet confidence of a man who had signed agreements worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. And around the table the executives leaned in almost imperceptibly, their movements subtle but synchronized, the quiet choreography of experienced dealmakers recognizing the final seconds before commitment. While Daniel Monroe's expression remained calm, his posture relaxed, one arm resting lightly against the chair, as if nothing about the moment required urgency. Yet Ava Brooks noticed the slight stillness in his shoulders, the careful patience in his eyes, the kind of composure that came from knowing exactly how events were about to unfold, and her attention returned to the document, the language repeating in her mind with increasing clarity, the liability clause positioned carefully beneath. Projections, the percentage allocation shifting risk in a way that appeared balanced at first glance, but tilted sharply once the timeline expanded beyond 12 months. And Ava felt the same quiet certainty settle in her chest that she used to feel when solving complex case studies late at night, when the answer revealed itself slowly, then all at once, undeniable and precise, and she glanced briefly toward the skyline beyond the glass, where the last hints of twilight faded into deep blue, the city lights flickering on one by one, and she remembered walking 12 blocks through that same skyline after her evening shifts, the cold winter air sharp against her face, her phone tucked into her coat pocket as she listened to recorded lectures, repeating legal terms softly to herself while passing closed storefronts and quiet intersections, because learning had never been easy, but she had held on to it anyway, piece by piece, night after night. And now those same lessons surfaced in her mind as William Harrington lowered the pen slightly, the tip nearly touching the paper, and the room seemed to narrow, the faint hum of the air conditioning becoming suddenly noticeable, the distant sound of traffic softened by thick glass, and Ava felt the seconds compress, the moment approaching its final point, and she shifted her weight just enough to set the tray gently against the edge of the service stand beside her. The faint metallic contact barely audible, yet it grounded her, and she took a slow breath, her gaze steady, her voice still unspoken, and Victor Lang near the doorway adjusted his stance slightly, noticing her movement but not questioning it. While one of the executives cleared his throat softly, the quiet sound echoing lightly against the high ceiling, and Daniel Monroe leaned forward a fraction, his smile unchanged, as William Harrington's pen descended another inch, and Ava realized that once the ink touched the page, the shift in responsibility would be locked into place. The risk transferred silently beneath layers of professional language, and the thought settled with a quiet weight. And without raising her voice, without breaking her calm, Ava stepped forward half a step, her posture composed, her expression steady, the room still unaware of her intention. And she prepared to speak just as William Harrington's pen hovered at the final point above the signature line. "Sir, you may want to review Section 14 before you sign," Ava Brooks said softly, her voice calm and measured, yet clear enough to cut gently through the quiet tension surrounding the table, and William Harrington's pen stopped midair, hovering just above the paper as if the words had physically interrupted the motion, and for a brief second no one moved, the room holding its breath in a silence so complete that the faint hum of the overhead lighting became suddenly noticeable, while Daniel Monroe's smile faltered almost imperceptibly, his fingers still resting against the folder, and William slowly lifted his eyes, not fully turning his head at first, as if unsure whether the voice had truly come from beside him. And when he finally looked at Ava, his expression remained composed but slightly narrowed, the calm authority still present, yet now touched with curiosity, and Victor Lang shifted subtly near the doorway, his posture stiffening as he realized what had just happened, because waitstaff were expected to move quietly, to remain invisible, never to step into the flow of a negotiation, and one of the executives leaned back in his chair, eyebrows lifting, while another glanced briefly toward Ava's name tag before returning his gaze to William, and the silence stretched again, heavy but controlled, and William lowered his pen slowly, placing it carefully beside the document, the deliberate motion reflecting years of disciplined decision-making, and he studied Ava for a moment, his expression unreadable, before speaking in a calm voice that carried authority without raising volume, asking which part of Section 14, and Ava met his gaze respectfully, her posture steady, her hands resting lightly at her sides, and she replied that the liability allocation beginning on line 3 shifted operational responsibility after the first fiscal year, and that the percentage appeared balanced at first glance, but expanded significantly when combined with the projected revenue delays outlined earlier in the document. And as she spoke, the words flowed naturally, not rushed, not hesitant, the terminology precise yet calm, and several heads around the table turned toward the document, the quiet rustle of paper breaking the stillness, while Daniel Monroe leaned back slightly, his relaxed posture tightening just enough to notice, and William opened the folder again, his eyes scanning the page Ava had referenced, and the room filled with small movements, executives adjusting their glasses, chairs shifting slightly, and Victor Lang remained still near the doorway, watching the shift unfold with careful attention, and Ava did not move, her expression composed, her presence steady but unobtrusive, and William's eyes moved slowly across the paragraph, his jaw tightening slightly as he read further, and the quiet confidence that had filled the room moments earlier softened into something more cautious, and one of the executives leaned forward, asking quietly if that adjustment extended beyond the 12-month mark, and Ava responded calmly that the clause referenced cumulative liability rather than fixed exposure, and another executive reached for his tablet, tapping lightly to confirm projections, and Daniel Monroe's fingers tightened briefly against the edge of the folder before he relaxed them again, his expression controlled but no longer effortless. And William read the clause again, slower this time, his focus deepening, and the room felt different now, the air shifting from certainty to careful reconsideration, and outside the windows the city lights shimmered quietly, reflecting across the glass as the silence settled once more. But this time it was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of realization beginning to form. William Harrington's eyes remained fixed on the document as the room settled into a deeper stillness, the kind that formed when certainty began to crack, and he turned the page slightly, scanning the clause again, slower this time, his expression tightening in subtle increments that only those closest to him could notice, while one of the executives leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and another quietly pulled the document closer, tracing the lines with careful attention, and Daniel Monroe shifted in his seat, his posture still controlled but no longer relaxed. The faint confidence that had filled his expression earlier now replaced with measured patience. And Ava Brooks remained where she stood, her shoulders calm, her breathing steady, her gaze lowered respectfully, as if she had simply answered a question rather than altered the direction of a multimillion-dollar decision. And William's finger moved along the paragraph, pausing briefly at the percentage allocation, then moving further down to the reference timeline. And he leaned back slightly, the leather chair releasing a soft creak that seemed louder than it should have. And he reached for the pen again, but did not lift it, instead tapping it gently against the table once, the quiet sound echoing lightly. And one of the executives spoke carefully, asking whether the cumulative exposure extended beyond projected operational costs. And Ava responded with the same calm tone that had not changed since she first spoke, explaining that the clause connected operational delays to performance penalties, which compounded over time if projected revenue milestones were not met within the first 18 months. And the executive beside William nodded slowly, turning to check the financial projections again, while Daniel Monroe finally spoke, his voice smooth and composed, saying that the clause reflected standard risk distribution for long-term acquisitions, and his words flowed easily, but the effortless confidence from earlier had softened, replaced with a measured explanation rather than a definitive assurance. And William listened without interrupting, his gaze returning to the document, and the quiet tension in the room thickened, not confrontational, but thoughtful. And Victor Lang remained still near the doorway, watching the shift in atmosphere, recognizing how quickly power dynamics could change when uncertainty entered the conversation. And Ava stood quietly, her presence still understated, yet now impossible to ignore. And William flipped back one page, cross-referencing the projections, and his jaw tightened slightly as he reviewed the revenue timeline. And another executive leaned in, asking softly whether the delay assumptions aligned with market volatility projections. And Ava responded calmly that the projections appeared optimistic compared to recent industry performance. And a second executive nodded, quietly confirming that recent quarterly reports suggested slower adoption rates. And Daniel Monroe adjusted his cuff, his expression controlled, but his fingers lingered briefly as if recalibrating his next words. And William finally set the pen down fully, sliding it a few inches away from the document, the motion deliberate and quiet. And the room shifted again, the subtle signal understood by everyone at the table. And William leaned forward, folding his hands lightly, his voice calm but more deliberate now, asking Ava how she had noticed the clause. And Ava answered simply that she had studied similar contract structures during her coursework, and the explanation was delivered without pride, without hesitation, just quiet honesty. And William studied her for a moment longer, and the silence that followed felt different from before, not dismissive, not impatient, but thoughtful, as the weight of her words settled across the table, and outside the windows the Chicago skyline glowed softly, the reflections shimmering across the glass, while inside the room the decision that once felt inevitable now rested quietly in reconsideration. William Harrington leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers still folded together, and the room remained suspended in a quiet that felt heavier than before, not tense, not hostile, but thoughtful, the kind of silence that followed when assumptions quietly shifted beneath the surface. And Ava Brooks stood calmly beside the table, her posture relaxed yet attentive, her eyes lowered respectfully, as if she had simply fulfilled a small duty rather than altered the direction of a decision worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And the soft glow of the chandelier reflected across the polished walnut surface, casting warm highlights across the documents now spread wider across the table, while outside the floor-to-ceiling windows the Chicago skyline shimmered in calm stillness. distant headlights moving slowly along Lakeshore Drive like quiet streams of light, and William glanced once more at the clause, his gaze slower now, deliberate, absorbing each line with the patience of someone accustomed to weighing consequences carefully. And Daniel Monroe adjusted slightly in his seat, his posture composed, though the effortless ease from earlier had softened into measured attentiveness. And one of the executives quietly cleared his throat, the faint sound echoing gently, while another tapped his tablet again, reviewing projections with increased scrutiny, and Ava remained still, her breathing calm, her hands resting naturally at her sides, and she felt the familiar quiet resolve settle deeper within her. The same calm she found during long winter mornings walking to the train station, the cold air brushing her face while she reviewed lecture notes on her phone, repeating definitions softly under her breath, determined to hold on to knowledge even when exhaustion weighed heavily. And now that discipline reflected in her composed presence, and William finally looked up again, his gaze resting on Ava with a new attentiveness, not curiosity alone, but consideration, as though he were reassessing the quiet figure who had moments earlier been invisible within the room. And Victor Lang near the doorway shifted his weight slightly, recognizing the subtle transformation in the atmosphere, and the executives around the table remained silent, waiting, sensing the shift but allowing William to lead the moment, and the faint sound of ice settling in a glass broke the stillness, a small detail that seemed amplified within the calm, and William slowly reached for the document again, turning the page with measured care, cross-referencing the projections once more, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he reviewed the timeline, and Daniel Monroe folded his hands lightly, his expression calm but watchful, and Ava remained composed, her presence quiet but grounded. And William set the document down once more, exhaling softly, the sound almost imperceptible, yet signaling reflection, and the city lights outside continued to shimmer, steady and distant, while inside the room the decision that once seemed immediate now stretched into thoughtful reconsideration, and William's gaze returned briefly to Ava, not dismissive, not distant, but thoughtful, and in that quiet moment the entire room felt changed, as if the balance of certainty had shifted gently, guided not by force or volume, but by calm clarity and quiet courage. William Harrington's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the document as he turned one final page, his movements slow and deliberate, and the quiet in the room deepened again, the kind of silence that formed when a decision began to shift direction, and he leaned forward slightly, studying the revenue projections more closely, his eyes moving from column to column, and then back to the clause Ava had referenced, and the faint tightening of his jaw returned, more noticeable now, while one of the executives beside him adjusted his chair, leaning in to follow the numbers with careful attention, and another quietly nodded as if confirming the emerging concern, and Daniel Monroe's posture remained composed, yet the ease in his expression had faded into measured stillness, his fingers interlaced loosely in front of him, and Ava Brooks stood quietly beside the service stand, her presence calm and grounded, her gaze lowered respectfully, and she felt the weight of the moment settle around her, the quiet intensity familiar in a way she had experienced during late-night study sessions when a complicated problem finally revealed its true structure, and William reached for the tablet placed near the center of the table, sliding it toward himself, the soft movement drawing subtle attention, and he tapped lightly, pulling up the market forecast referenced in the projections, and the glow of the screen reflected faintly across his face, illuminating the careful focus in his expression. And the numbers aligned differently when viewed against the latest data, the optimistic timeline appearing less certain, the margin of exposure expanding gradually, and William exhaled softly, the sound barely audible, and he set the tablet down, his gaze returning to Daniel Monroe, and for a moment neither man spoke, the silence holding steady as understanding formed quietly between them, and William finally spoke, his voice calm but more deliberate than before, saying that the timeline appeared aggressive given current adoption trends, and Daniel responded smoothly, explaining that Monroe Capital anticipated accelerated growth following integration, yet his tone carried a measured caution rather than the earlier certainty, and one of the executives leaned forward, pointing gently at the document, noting that the cumulative exposure over 18 months exceeded initial projections if adoption slowed even slightly, and another executive nodded, quietly confirming the calculation. And Ava remained still, her calm presence unchanged, and William glanced once more at the clause, then slowly slid the document closed, the soft sound of paper settling echoing lightly across the polished table, and the subtle gesture signaled a shift that everyone in the room understood, and William reached for his pen, lifted it briefly, then set it down again beside the folder, deliberately placing it farther from the signature line, and the quiet transformation in the room became unmistakable, and Victor Lang near the doorway observed the moment with quiet awareness. Recognizing the rare shift in momentum that came not from confrontation but from clarity, and William turned his gaze toward Ava once more, not dismissive, not distant, but thoughtful, and he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, acknowledging the insight that had altered the evening, and outside the windows the city lights shimmered steadily, while inside the room the decision that once seemed inevitable had quietly changed course, guided by a calm voice and a moment of quiet courage. William Harrington's nod lingered for a moment, subtle yet unmistakable, and the room seemed to exhale quietly as the shift became final, the decision no longer rushing forward but settling into careful reconsideration, and he opened the folder once more, sliding it gently toward the center of the table as if resetting the conversation entirely, and Daniel Monroe adjusted his posture, his expression composed but thoughtful, his earlier confidence replaced with measured diplomacy, while one of the executives leaned back slightly, folding his hands as the weight of the avoided risk settled in, and Ava Brooks remained still beside the service stand, her posture calm, her presence unobtrusive, and the soft glow from the chandelier reflected across her name tag, catching the letters briefly before fading again, and William glanced toward her once more, then turned his attention to Victor Lang near the doorway, asking quietly if they could have a few more minutes before the next course. And Victor nodded immediately, stepping back with professional ease, understanding that the conversation had shifted from routine to meaningful, and the door closed softly, sealing the room again in quiet reflection, and William rested his hands lightly on the table, his voice calm as he addressed the group, saying that they would pause the signing until the clause was restructured and reviewed again, and the executives nodded in agreement, their expressions thoughtful rather than tense, while Daniel Monroe inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the decision with composed professionalism, and the tension that once hovered in the room dissolved into a quieter, more respectful atmosphere, and William turned his gaze back toward Ava, studying her for a brief moment, then speaking in a tone that carried quiet sincerity, asking how long she had been studying contract law, and Ava answered simply that she had paused her degree 3 years earlier, but continued taking online courses at night, and William nodded slowly, absorbing the answer, and one of the executives exchanged a brief glance with another, the quiet recognition passing between them, and the room felt warmer. Now, not because of the lighting, but because the atmosphere had softened into something more human, and William reached for his water glass, taking a slow sip, then placing it carefully back on the table, and he thanked Ava calmly, the words simple yet deliberate, and Ava inclined her head slightly, her expression composed, her voice quiet as she replied that she was glad she could help, and the acknowledgement settled gently across the table, and Daniel Monroe offered a small nod of respect in Ava's direction, the gesture subtle but meaningful, and Victor Lang returned quietly to the doorway, sensing the conversation easing, and outside the windows the Chicago skyline shimmered steadily, the lights reflecting softly across the glass, while inside the room the atmosphere had shifted completely, no longer defined by authority alone, but by quiet recognition, and Ava stepped back slightly, returning to her place beside the service stand, her movements calm and natural, and the executives resumed their conversation at a slower pace, now grounded in careful consideration, and William glanced once more at Ava, his expression thoughtful, as if committing the moment to memory, and the room settled into a calm silence that felt different from before, softer, steadier, shaped by respect rather than assumption. The conversation resumed quietly, but the energy in the room had changed in a way that no one needed to explain, and Ava Brooks stepped back toward the service stand, her movements calm and practiced, lifting the silver tray again with steady hands. While the executives continued speaking in softer tones, their discussion now focused on revising projections and restructuring terms, and William Harrington listened carefully, occasionally nodding, his expression thoughtful rather than decisive. And outside the windows, the Chicago skyline glowed in steady patterns of white and amber lights, reflecting softly across the glass as the night deepened, and the faint sound of distant traffic drifted upward, muted and far away. And Ava moved quietly to refill water glasses, her presence once again subtle, yet no longer invisible, and one of the executives offered a brief appreciative glance as she set a glass down, the small gesture carrying quiet respect, and Daniel Monroe leaned back slightly, reviewing notes on his tablet, his posture composed, though the earlier certainty had softened into careful professionalism. And Victor Lang returned with the next course, moving with polished efficiency, and the gentle clink of plates settling on the table blended into the calm rhythm of the room. And Ava placed each setting with quiet precision, her focus steady, her movements graceful, and when she finished she stepped back again, her eyes briefly lifting toward the skyline before lowering respectfully. And William noticed the gesture, following her glance for a moment, observing the city lights stretching beyond the glass. And he seemed to reflect quietly, his expression softened by the stillness. And after a moment he gathered the documents together, sliding them neatly into the folder, signaling the end of the formal discussion for the evening. And the executives nodded, their conversation easing into lighter tones, and Daniel Monroe offered a calm handshake across the table, acknowledging the decision to revisit terms, and William returned the gesture with composed professionalism. And the atmosphere settled into calm closure, and Ava stepped forward once more to clear the table, her movements smooth and efficient. And as she reached for the final glass, William spoke softly, thanking her again. The words simple yet sincere, and Ava inclined her head slightly, her expression warm but modest, and she continued her work without lingering. And the executives began to rise from their chairs, the soft scrape of leather against hardwood echoing gently. And Victor Lang opened the door quietly, allowing the distant sounds of the restaurant to drift back into the room. The faint murmur of conversation, the gentle clinking of glassware, the warm hum of a busy evening continuing beyond the private space. And Ava carried the tray toward the doorway, her footsteps quiet against the floor, and as she passed beneath the chandelier, the light reflected softly across her name tag once more, Ava Brooks, the letters catching the glow before fading as she stepped into the hallway. And behind her the room settled into stillness again, the polished table now cleared, the documents closed. And William Harrington remained standing for a moment longer, gazing out at the city lights with a thoughtful expression, and the silence that followed felt calm and complete, shaped not by authority, but by quiet recognition, as the night moved forward and the glow of the skyline reflected softly across the glass.